Hi, my name is Ben Lee, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Paul G. Allen School for Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. And today I'll be discussing PDF work with the Library of Congress Web Archives, and all of this work is in collaboration with Trevor Owens. As a brief outline of the talk that I'll give over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll start with a brief background and introduction to the importance of exploratory search for web archiving. I'll then turn to the Library of Congress 1000.gov PDF dataset. And then I'll turn to the real central contribution of this talk, which is a pipeline for multimodal search and discovery across this data set, and wrap up with an eye toward large-scale exploratory search systems for government PDFs and beyond. So let me start with an introduction and motivate I think the real central question of this talk, which is how do we explore, make sense of, analyze web archives at scale? Here in particular, we'll be thinking about PDFs, but I think this really generalizes well to all sorts of questions that scholars are asking and researchers are asking across different fields and disciplines. So within my home field of computer science, we see how web archives are really central to machine learning research. Here we can think of foundational models being trained with web derivatives, Common Crawl being used for GPT-3, the Yahoo Flickr Creative Commons 100 million dataset for vision tasks, and the web image text dataset for the multimodal clip system. And if we take a look at the GPT-3 paper, even, we see how much of the paper is devoted to the kinds of data being used to train the system. And here I think this really motivates the need for exploratory search and sense making over these kinds of web archives to really understand compositions and get a sense of what's going on. In the domain of social science, we see that web archives are already central. Fields from sociology to political science to economics to international affairs all rely on web archives in one way, shape, or form in order to conduct research. And lastly, in the domain of history, here I'll quote Ian Milligan's wonderful book, History in the Age of Abundance, where Ian says that our historical record is being and will be profoundly affected by the advent of these massive born digital repositories. And so this is especially important as, of course, post-1990s topics enter the domain of historical research. And here we can think about new questions, new subjects, and new methodologies. But with that, let me go ahead from this sort of broad framing and narrow in on the specific data set of interest today. And so this is the Library of Congress 1000.gov PDF data set, which is available on loc.gov. I'll have a link to it in a sec. But here I'll quote LC Labs to describe the data set, where they say that this data set of 1,000 PDF files was generated from indexes of the web archives, which were used to derive a random list of 1,000 items identified as PDF files and hosted on .gov domains. And so this random data set, or this collection of 1,000 random PDFs, is available for download at the link below, and it is about 600 megabytes, 700 megabytes in total. So, pretty, manageable in terms of scope. And Trevor and I thought this would be a great starting point to be able to try to think about some of these questions about how we search, discover, and analyze across PDFs. So with that, let me go ahead and get into the heart of our work, which is this pipeline. I'll mention that this work that we've done appears in the International Journal of Digital Humanities. The paper is titled Grappling with the Scale of Born Digital Government Publications Toward Pipelines for Processing and Searching Millions of PDFs. And we also have a link to the archive paper as well, or the version of the preprint. But let me go ahead and talk about a scalable multimodal pipeline. And what I mean by this is really three central components of looking at these PDFs. First is metadata analysis. Here we can think of metadata facets like base URL or PDF length. Textual analysis, where we can use TF-IDF for all sorts of text embeddings. And then also visual analysis, where we can use image embeddings or the like to try to provide these different kinds of modes of analysis or search and discovery. So let me walk through what our pipeline looks like in practice in terms of how we actually parse all these PDFs. So for a given PDF, we can split it into a bunch of single pages here, just in terms of atomic units, and then split it into then its text and its actual image representation. So for the text, we can use PDF to text to convert each different page into a text file. And then we can combine these text documents into one representative text file for the PDF, and then generate all sorts of machine learning features off the text. Here we'll use TF-IDF. I'll motivate this a little bit later, but we can think about using whatever kind of machine learning sort of featurization we want at the end of this pipeline to be able to process the PDFs. In terms of the image-based representation or the visual representation here, we'll use ImageMagick to generate JPEG files for each of the pages. Then we can generate image embeddings using ResNet 50, which gives us 2048 dimensional vectors, which correspond to some sort of semantic similarity. Here, ResNet 50 is just an image recognition model, and by feeding it through and grabbing the penultimate the representation from the penultimate layer, we effectively have a representation that contains some semantic notions. So not just, say, color or texture, but really the content of the images as well. And then lastly, we can use the metadata that's provided in the actual data set from the web archiving team at the Library of Congress. And here we have tabular features like file size, URL, PDF length, things of this nature. So let me start with some basic metadata analysis. And this is motivated because basic metadata facets really facilitate browsing and sense making. Here, base URLs and PDF length inform our understanding of the corpus and gives us a sense of what's going on. So if we take a look at base URLs here, what I mean by this is we're basically just stacking the 1,000 PDFs and binning them according to the base URL. And we say that the most common is house.gov from the United States House of Representatives. 179 of these 1,000 PDFs correspond to house.gov. Then we have gpo.gov, uscourts.gov, idaho.gov, ky.gov. And once we get down to this point, we're down to of order 3%. And so what we see, of course, as we'd expect, is a pretty long tail in terms of the number of PDFs being represented here. And as you can imagine, if we scale up from 1,000 PDFs to millions on web archives, this distribution will look perhaps even more interesting as we're no longer restricted to just 1,000 PDF sample size. We can also do something where we take a look at, say, page count. And so what I mean by this is we take all the PDFs and bin them according to the number of pages within the PDF. And so we see that there are 327 single page PDFs, which is surprising. I guess that means that roughly a third of the PDFs in the corpus are a single page. Then we have 39% of the PDFs are actually 2 to 5 pages in length. So what this tells us is that over 70% of the corpus is consists of PDFs that are pretty small. 1 to 5 pages in total. And yet, if we look at the total number of pages in the corpus, we see that it's actually dominated by these PDFs that are 20 pages in length or beyond. We see that even though there are only 28 PDFs with 100 pages or more, that comprises about 6,800 pages in the corpus. And so this is an interesting sort of imbalance or interesting sort of contour to the data set in terms of how we think about processing it. I will mention that this kind of analysis on just page count actually gives us a sense of what the underlying nature of the PDF is. For PDFs that are 100 pages or more, these are oftentimes technical reports or things like PowerPoint slides that have been converted into PDF form. Let me go ahead and move over to textual analysis here. And in the interest of time, I just want to give some very basic motivation. So I'd say that most web archive interfaces rely on navigation of archive sites as their basic mode of access. Some smaller web archives have implemented full keyword text search methods, but there's a really central limitation here, which is that users are responsible for formulating keyword queries that retrieve relevant results. And what about if we want to help facilitate this? And so here we can think about alternative text-based approaches that can help facilitate navigating and understanding collections of government PDFs or web archives in general. So let me very briefly give an introduction to what TF-IDF is. So this is term frequency inverse document frequency, which is a measurement of the prevalence of a term within a document relative to how prevalent the term is throughout the entire corpus, which gives you a value of 0 to 1. And so what we can do is then for a whole bunch of terms in these documents, we can then evaluate the term frequency inverse document frequency, which effectively gives us a featurization or some sort of numerical representation of each document. And the higher the number means the more prevalent that word is to that document, term is to that document relative to the other documents in the collection. And so I'd say that I should mention here that we generated this TF-IDF featurization using what are known as unigrams. So this means terms are only single words, not multiple words. I'll say that TF-IDF is a baseline method of featurization. Typically these days we see it outperformed by neural text embedding models or transformers. But I will add that TF-IDF features are really easily interpretable. We understand that a high value of a certain term means that term is important to that document. That's very nice and succinct. And also I'll mention that the baseline method here more than suffices for demonstrating the utility of a text-based approach to government PDFs for search and discovery. So on this next page here, what we're finding are based on the base URLs, I'm taking each PDF for each of say all the PDFs within uscourts.gov. Then we're taking the TF-IDF featurization and averaging over those PDFs, which gives us a centroid. And then we can take the top terms, meaning the terms who have the highest values in this centroid. And so we find that these are actually really nice representations of these base URLs. So for the United States courts, we find the top terms are court, motion, filed, case, district. For say NOAA.gov, we find bay, forecast, sea, climate, chart, marine being the highest terms represented. And so this gives us a way of understanding these document collections or rather subgroupings, without having to parse through them manually. I mean, we get information that we wouldn't necessarily pick up with just the facets. Likewise, we can then go ahead and say, take these TF-IDF representations for all of the PDFs in house.gov and try to then subcluster them. We can imagine that not all these PDFs are the same or of the same content. There's going to be some variation. So we can use k-means clustering here to try to go ahead and look at, say, all the different clusters appearing in house.gov or USDA.gov. And doing this, we actually find some pretty straightforward partitionings. We find that for house.gov, we find clusters related to students and education, congressional press releases, healthcare, veterans. For FDA.gov, we find food labeling requirements, questions regarding medical waivers for hearing aids. And so once again here, what we're finding are patterns among documents that can't necessarily be inferred through existing metadata alone. Lastly, here I want to turn to visual analysis. Government PDFs are just as much visual artifacts as they are textual ones. So here with text-heavy documents, we can find text placements or font types may suggest specific document types like official records, and government seals on letterhead indicate what agency produced the document. And so these visual features provide information that cannot necessarily be extracted from just the textual content or metadata facets. And yet we find that visual search and analysis for born digital content has remained understudied. And so we wanted just to do some analysis over this 1,000 PDF data set. And so what I'm showing here is a visualization of the 1,000 front pages using those image embeddings generated using ResNet. And then we've clustered them using TSNE, which is a dimensionality reduction tool. And what we find is that if we zoom in on some of these clusters, we find some really interesting and semantically relevant ones. So for example, if we zoom in on this cluster, we find map content, which is a great way of isolating this collection that might not show up through facets or text. We find tabular data in spreadsheets. We find issues of the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. We find templated forms, news releases on letterhead, and perhaps my favorite, redacted front pages, which are really fun. I do want to very briefly just mention some use cases here. So these methods offer significant utility to a range of practitioners, from end users such as scholars who can use these methods to explore and analyze these collections, to curators who may utilize these approaches to assess a collection at scale, identify and label subcollections, find overabundances, and assess what is missing. Here, I just want to wrap up the last couple of minutes toward large-scale exploratory search systems for government PDFs. So I'd mentioned that web archives at scale can get quite big. So the 2008 end-of-term presidential web archive alone contains approximately 10 million PDFs. If we look across the LC and the Internet Archive, we find hundreds of millions of PDFs. And the question becomes, how do we actually support exploratory search systems that perform at scale? And so I want to mention that many of the methods that Trevor and I have used here are very straightforwardly scalable. And I also want to mention that we can think about all sorts of ways allowing users to define the kinds of content they're interested in searching over. Here's an interface from the Newspaper Navigator project that I've been working on, which you can find at the link below. And this is a search interface for visual content in the Library of Congress's Chronicling America collection, where we provide what I call open faceted search, a method by which users can actually define specific content or facets that they want to search over by selecting positive and negative examples. Here, defining facets in an open domain as opposed to just using a restricted set of predefined metadata facets. And so we can think about the utility here for visual or textual search in web archives as well. I do want to mention some exciting CS building blocks that we can find here. So we can think from the perspective of human-centered machine learning. We have all sorts of questions like identifying specific open faceted search affordances that are most useful, providing more granular modes of feedback, building out these affordances effectively and evaluating with real users, and lastly, expanding all these affordances to the petabyte scale for not only PDFs, but web archives more generally. With that, we would like to thank Mark Phillips and Abby Gracke for their input on this project, as well as the LC Web Archiving team for their work to archive government PDFs. We would also like to thank the other presenters in this QA session, as well as the organizers of Web Archiving Conference 2022. And I'll wrap this up by saying that this research is supported by an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship. And please do feel free to reach out. Here is my email and my Twitter handle. I'd always love to talk more about this work or web archiving in general. So thank you so much.